Yes. Okay. Well, hi there. Welcome everybody on YouTube and in the podcast feed. This is kind of a different episode than I usually do for Hugo's there, but if you have listened to my podcast for any length of time, you know that I'm a Christian and also that I respect the findings of modern science. And one of the aspects of that is evolution. And I've been asked by one of my guests before and by listeners, how does that even work? How are you a Christian and you accept evolution? And I kind of started doing some introspection about what that journey was like for me. And it occurred to me that I have some other people in my circle of internet friends, previous guests on the podcast, who might enjoy having a discussion about that, since they're maybe in similar places, but maybe having come from different faith traditions. And so I have assembled my panel here, and I'm going to introduce them. And what we're going to do is I'll just call your name and you can introduce yourself, a couple of facts about you and what faith tradition you grew up in, and maybe what, if it's changed, if you're in a different one now. So I'm just going to go clockwise. So Juan.
Okay, Juan San Miguel, avid science fiction reader and active fan, been many conventions. Faith tradition is traditional Roman Catholic. Grew up, got confirmed and everything, and more or less until COVID, maintained a regular church schedule, and that got disrupted. And I'm trying to slowly get back into that. So that's the simple story of it.
All right, cool. How about you, Mandy?
My name is Mandy Self. I'm an aerospace engineer out in New Mexico. I work on satellites, so that's a lot of fun. I grew up Southern Baptist in the South. So I've lived in Mississippi, Georgia, Florida, Texas, all over the place. Always in Southern Baptist churches. In Southern Baptist, we don't have confirmed, but I went forward in first grade. And got baptized then. And I've always been very serious about church. Even when I was really bullied a lot in church, actually. But I was always very serious about Sunday school and things like that. Now I actually go to a Presbyterian church, but I don't consider myself Presbyterian. I am not Reformed. But I really enjoy my church, and they let me teach middle school Sunday school, which is fun because I can do whatever I want. Nice. So yeah, that's where I'm at right now. I would say my beliefs don't really fit in any denominational box anymore. So
understood. All right, how about you, JW?
Yeah, so I'm JW Wartic. I would call myself also an avid sci-fi fan. I grew up in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which is sort of like one of the more conservative branches of Lutheranism in the United States. Basically in college went through sort of like some faith crises and things, and ended up in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, so one of the mainline denominations. And I would consider that pretty much in line with where I stand now. So yeah.
Okay. For me, so I grew up in Assemblies of God churches, which were very big, especially on things like the dispensational premillennial, the rapture is happening probably next week kind of thing. I remember vividly, I think I'm older than you two, but maybe not older than one. I remember a book called 88 Reasons Why the Lord Will Return in 1988. And very conservative church, but also, very kind of loud and expressive. Lots of speaking in tongues and very loud worship music and that kind of stuff. But kind of from college on, I went to a Quaker college, but I'm not sure I ever went to a Quaker church. But the most recent church that I've attended regularly was a Presbyterian church as well, like you, Mandy, but I've never considered myself a Presbyterian. And yes, I do not consider myself Reformed in any way, other than I'm a Protestant. So that's it. And so yeah, I've kind of been non-denominational since then. And I did want to mention, JW has been doing, you've been doing a series on your blog about kind of leaving Missouri Synod, right?
Yeah, so on my blog, it's jwwartic.com. I've been writing a series. I decided it was finally sort of time to write about all the reasons that I left my former denomination, because I, was essentially from birth. I mean, we baptized infants, and from there on, like, was LCMS pastor's kid. I went to LCMS schools all the way through 8th grade, and then again in college. Initially was studying to be a teacher, and eventually studied to be a pastor. So like lots of deep background in that, which unfortunately ran into a lot of things that were sort of off-putting. Well, very
Right.
off-putting.
Right. And that ties into this conversation a bit as well. So we can kind of move into what teaching did you kind of grow up in with regard to things like creation and evolution, human origins, that kind of thing. So Juan, why don't you go ahead and go first?
Well, as I remember, when we have CCD, which is catechism, and I forget what the other initials. I'm bad at that, but so this, for those of you who don't, for people who don't know, that's an after-school thing if you're not going to a parochial church. And a few years ago, I found out my dad considered sending me to the church school until it found out in 1970 that would have been $40 a month or something, and he felt, whoa, okay, but no. And so in 6th grade, I remember we essentially learned the Bible. I mean, we learned our prayers, and we've already been had our first communion and confession. So we all learned that stuff. I just remembered specifically, we had a brother, I don't know what his denomination was, but essentially we were learning the key stories of the Bible. And it seems like the first half of the class, we would work on the Old Testament, and then we'd see a film strip on the Gospels. At least this is how I remember. And then I think he would always continue in the class of a film strip on the Gospel. And then when after he covered the Old Testament, he would cover the New Testament. And so I think it was very traditional. So I guess that would have been my first, although I'm probably sure in Mass, you would have heard the creation story or some passage of Genesis. I mean, in Catholicism, I mean, you go through 3 cycles of readings each year, and you encounter the same things about the time. So I think, that's where at least I learned, Genesis.
Yeah.
We weren't told like watch out for evolution or anything like that. He just told us a story and then moved on, and that's about all that I can remember.
Yeah, CCD, you said it was catechism class, so you would have learned like the range of possible, like, here are the things you can believe, but here's the things you must believe.
I don't know if it was ever stricted out. I mean, the one thing, like, this same brother wanted us to make sure, and I'm pretty sure my other teachers wanted to make sure that, like, communion is Christ. That's Christ. You don't question that. You don't. It's not symbolic. And I know that I think other faiths might have that. So I mean, it was stuff like that we wanted to get clear.
Yeah.
Those concepts. At least that's how I remember it.
Okay, cool. What about you, Mandy? What was the teaching that you got about creation?
So through the church, I got a very traditional teaching. So Southern Baptists are very literal.
Yes.
When it comes to Genesis and a lot of other texts. I also went to Pensacola Christian Academy for kindergarten and 1st grade, which is probably one of the most traditional, I think it's technically independent Baptist, it might be American Baptist schools in the nation. You can go pre-K through like master's degree and be in school there. And I remember getting Bible stories in class, then, with the big cards and stuff. A lot of the churches I went to didn't really encourage questions. And I was always a kid who asked questions. But from my parents, I got a very different perspective. So I've said before on the podcast that I am a geek raised by geeks. So my parents were huge Trek nerds. They were huge into sci-fi. So we did a lot of thought experiments growing up that were kind of like, well, what if evolution is true? What does that mean? Does that make you question your faith? So we had a lot of discussions like that growing up. And so I will say the church gave me a very indoctrinated traditional teaching, and my parents gave me a much more to use a word they'd probably hate, liberal teaching of how to interpret the text.
Yeah, or at least nuanced, right?
Yes.
Okay. How about you, JW?
Yeah, so I mean, some of my earliest memories were going to the library and getting books about dinosaurs from the library,
Right.
and that sort of ties into what I learned about creationism. From the earliest age that I can remember, I was taught young Earth creationism this was the way. There was no other way. Anyone who disagreed with that could not believe the Bible. And I remember distinctly like reading some of my dinosaur books, on the floor. And when I started to actually learn to read, it would say things like millions of years and things like that. And and I would be told that was, wrong. Scientists are wrong about that. And that started to change too, like when I was in school, and I don't remember if it was my parents or teachers or all of the above, but it definitely turned into like a scientists are lying about this, not just that they're mistaken, but that they're actively deceiving people about the age of the Earth. And so that just basically continued through, through high school, and including things like where there was one day I remember learning in school about plate tectonics and going home. This was maybe like sixth grade, so it was at a Lutheran school, and went home and was told plate tectonics don't exist. Like that's not something that happens. So like it took me sort of by surprise, because I think I was old enough at that point to sort of realize like this is a good explanation for why earthquakes happen. But when everyone that you trust is telling you, hey, like that's wrong, don't believe that, like who are you going to trust? Some random book or a random teacher, or are you going to trust everyone that has ever been right about everything? So it wasn't until college, ironically at an LCMS school, but we had an adjunct professor who I think had absolutely no connection to Lutheranism whatsoever, who was a geology professor and just walked us through mainstream geology and absolutely blew my mind. So that's when I really sort of encountered other views. I knew like evolution was a thing, but I had no concept of what it taught, other than that it was a bunch of liars, essentially.
Right. Well, you're kind of jumping ahead to point 3, but we'll come back to that. For me, I don't remember there being a lot of actual teaching about creation or evolution. Any literature I had access to was absolutely young Earth creationist, and I remember kind of reading things that were like, yeah, there's this big lie by all these atheist scientists to prop up evolution. But it wasn't something that really came up as a topic of conversation unless it was in school, when I would start encountering these other ideas. But I actually remember, like, even in high school, my world history teacher, she was teaching us about early man and that kind of stuff. But she also showed like this video that was about the Genesis creation account, which I thought was like, you couldn't do that in school anymore. But she was trying to teach the controversy, right? And she wasn't a Christian, but she found it an interesting story. And then she started going through the creation story from the Greeks and from the Romans and from the Egyptians and that kind of stuff. So I actually thought it was kind of a healthy way to approach it. So all of us had some sort of teaching about this growing up, but was there a particular point when your views started to change? JW, it sounded like you were hinting at that. And maybe since you were already doing that, maybe we'll just circle back around to you and go the opposite direction.
Sure. Yeah, like I said, it was pretty much in college when I started to encounter anything different more actively in geology class, but also I started to get really into Christian apologetics then. And alongside that, a lot of the apologists that I had respect for, I started to discover were not young Earth creationists. And that was like utterly shocking to me, because everything I had ever been taught is that if you reject literal 10,000 or 6,000 years, it was kind of like, it's okay for it to be 4,000 years older, but not millions of years. Right. If you rejected that, you just rejected the Bible, period. Right. So you couldn't have that plus Christianity. So when I started to see some of the apologists were not holding the same young Earth view, I started to really like read more of what they wrote about this issue. And obviously, like, the internet is a wealth of resources, good and bad. And so just really started to dig deeply and get warned by people about how much I was straying from the faith. And I distinctly remember crying, talking to one of my spiritual leaders in my dorm, and like, how can I accept the Bible if I don't really think that what I've been taught about the age of the earth makes sense? And he said to me, like, hey, like, if the earth is 3 billion years old or whatever, do you think that that actually impacts whether Jesus rose from the dead?
Right.
And I was kind of like, well, no, I guess not. And he's like, well, there you go. Like, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And to his credit, he was definitely an LCMS. He was definitely young earth creationist. He was studying to be a pastor. But in the moment, he knew that's kind of what I needed to hear. And
Right.
I think that was really valuable. But it was, I mean, multiple crises of faith because, again, I hadn't just been taught that it was wrong. It was lies. So I had to
Right.
dig myself out of this mentality that it was a bunch of lies.
Yeah. Yeah. I had read one of Ken Ham's books at some point when I was starting to think about this kind of thing. And, he says this explicitly, and Answers in Genesis pretty much says it's like, if you reject young earth creationism, you're throwing out the whole Bible. And at some point I'm like, who else agrees with that? Atheists. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's a good place to be. But what about you, Mandy? It sounded like you had more of a nuanced kind of view on it, but how did you evolve?
So, growing up in the church, right? Everybody's like, it's definitely, God created it all exactly like it says in the Bible. Nobody really used the phrase young earth creationism, I think, but that was definitely kind of what they were teaching. I didn't really hear that dinosaurs were fake until high school when another girl in the youth group said that to me. And I was like truly shocked. I was like, what? So you think they go out and bury these bones and then dig them back up? To what means? Paleontologists are not rich.
Right.
Like, but my parents had a lot more nuanced view. I mean, my parents are really interesting in like the things that they believe, because they can be very literal. And then they can ask these like weird questions. So like, I remember my mom taking me to young earth creationist talks where they talked about how the Grand Canyon was created in the Great Flood. Right. It could not be millions of years old. And my mom being like, well, this makes complete sense. Like everything they're saying makes complete sense. Yeah. And I'm sitting here like, well, that's not what you told me like 10 years ago, like, so when it came to like what my parents were telling me, I guess it was less like evolution definitely happened versus young earth creationism happened versus if you believe evolution, does that affect your faith? Right. Like, and let's do a thought experiment. Let's say evolution is real. What does that conflict with the Bible? And we'd ask questions like that. And my mom would be like, well, if evolution's real, do you think Moses would have understood it if God had told it to him?
Right.
And I'd be like, well, no. And she's like, so how would Moses write it in the Bible? And I'd be like, well, that's a good question. Right. Or other weird, like even weirder thought experiments that are probably even more heretical, that would be like, well, let's look at human evolution. Right. So there are bunches of humans, right, that come along. So what about Adam and Eve? Right. And my mom would be like, well, what if Adam and Eve were just the first people God gave souls to? What if he just plucked two Neanderthals or whatever and then put them in the Garden of Eden? And I was like, oh, what if he did do that? Right. Like, and so none of these were like, this has to be the answer. It was just like, none of these questions have to be things that cause you to throw the Bible out the window.
Right.
Right.
That reminds me, like I see like on Facebook, sometimes I see this t-shirt, like science teas or something. And it says, I'd rather have questions without answers than answers that can't be questioned. And I really hate it. Like I think fundamentally, like people who are non-theists don't really understand the way theists think and don't respect it. Right. And they think that essentially all of us take this recipe of stuff that we have and we just integrate that perfectly without any questioning of it at all. And that's just not been my experience, but I don't know.
Yeah. So
I understand the stereotype.
Yeah. Over time, I've probably just gotten farther away from young earth creationism and definitely believe in evolution for the most part. And I'm even at the point where I'm like, the Adam and Eve story is a fable, right? It exists in the Bible to teach us something, but there probably weren't an Adam and Eve. Right. But my parents are not there, right? They're still like, there was an Adam and Eve. But it was through this kind of like think. My mom really encouraged us to think about what we were being taught at church, and that it was okay to question, just maybe not at church,
Right.
because you got to keep up appearances, right? So bring your questions home.
Yeah. What about you, Juan? Was there any wrestling with this?
There might have been a little bit, but the thing is, which my first encounter of evolution wasn't even in a classroom. It was unfortunately, my age, I saw Cosmos by Carl Sagan on its first run, which was heavily promoted by PBS. I mean, it was a big get. And if any of you ever saw it, they demonstrate evolution with this line animation of going from single cells all the way to woman. That evolves into woman. It was so powerful. Seth MacFarlane had to put it into one of his own episodes of his Cosmos sequel. So that was my first encounter, and I really don't remember getting any pushback. It just says, well, that makes sense, and just continued on my way. But at that point, I mean, I was starting to get into heavily science fiction. I was reading more. I mean, although this is pre-teens, I mean, I was getting heavy into science fiction reading by 14, but I was a media fan at a young age.
Yeah.
So I don't, never had to deal with, and I don't think it was that big of an issue with my parents. I think my mom was kind of a creationist, and my father's relationship to the church was kind of interesting because my grandmother was she had family in Spain and she was a loyalist. So the church was not on the correct side, in her opinion, during the Spanish Civil War. So she was not, I don't think she pushed religion on my dad. So I didn't really get any pushback. And then I later in life, I found out that Roman Catholicism, the Jesuits have been teaching evolution since the early 1900s. So I remember I told that to a friend of mine who claims she's an agnostic, but I think she's really an atheist, but just doesn't want to deal with atheist baggage. She goes, "Oh, it's those Jesuits. You never know what's up with them." Or, she made some type of funny Jesuit comment.
Yeah.
Which amused me, at least. But
yeah, I mean, I know, like, I've made something of a study of the Catholic Church earlier in my life, and so I know that there are things in the Catechism that say, you have liberty to believe a number of things about evolution and creation. You do have to believe in a fall. That's an important doctrine for Catholics.
Right.
And that kind of goes to what you were talking about the questioning about Adam and Eve. Anything else on kind of the backgrounds and kind of when you first started encountering evolution and trying to take it on board, or do we want to move on?
I was just gonna say, funny story. I think my first exposure to the word evolution or the concept was actually Star Trek Next Generation, that terrible episode where everyone de-evolves.
Oh boy.
So
oh god, that was a late season one.
Yeah.
And trivia, Kate McFadden, that was her chance to direct. They gave her that story.
Yeah, it's a bad episode.
I thought you were going to say the earlier one where it's the matriarchy planet where Riker gets dressed up in silky stuff, and he says at some point, you can stop revolution, but you cannot stop evolution. For me, my process was kind of reading books. It makes sense because I like books, and I do also wonder, like, for people who enjoy speculative fiction, are we more likely to be the ones who are like engaging those questions? I don't know, maybe it's an open question, but for me, I started reading basically anything I had on my shelf that related to this. And so, like I said, I read Ken Ham's book, Answers in Genesis. Not Answers in Genesis, The Genesis Solution. And then, like, I encountered old Earth creationism through Reasons to Believe, Hugh Ross, and then just kind of kept reading more and more widely. And I just, like, I think I read one of Hank Hanegraaff's Young Earth Creationist books, and it just was not convincing me. And I'd kind of settled into the intelligent design, like I kind of feel like it's a little bit of a cop-out position where you're like, I want to believe it in the old Earth and that kind of stuff, and essentially that evolution happened. I just want to believe that it was more directed. And I used to really, really bristle against anybody who was like, yeah, but intelligent design isn't science. intelligent design is just relabeled creationism. And it wasn't until I'd read a few books from actual people who supported evolution. I read Ken Miller's book, Only a Theory. And it was all about like the Kansas school board case. I can't remember what it was called. Trying to remember what the city was, but I mean, like it's in the case name, but you can check out that book. And in that one, essentially he hits intelligent design pretty hard and is like, no, here's why it's not science. These are the reasons. And these are the reasons that I'm calling it creationism. And the reason is that there was a book that was being put in the schools in Kansas called Of Pandas and People. And it was absolutely a creationist book. And it was rejected because it was teaching religion in public schools. And so the publisher went back and replaced creator with intelligent designer, just did a search and replace, like with hilarious results. And so I was like, okay, I get the argument now that intelligent design is essentially creationism just over a larger period of time. So that's when I kind of went, I guess the best evidence is evolution. And then I've been just trying to figure out how to integrate that with theology since then. And I'm not sure I've really arrived, but like you, Mandy, I've been like asking those questions and going, what do I do with Adam and Eve? Were they real? I don't know. We'll see. Was the process easy for all of you, or was there pain involved? Because for me, it was painful. Kind of finding out that all the stuff that I'd been taught about evolution as the big lie, that was kind of the big lie. So any comments on that? Anybody?
I don't.
JW, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead.
I would say, I guess for me, it has been, and I would say probably still continues to be fairly painful. Just a lot of baggage from basically all of my family and friends, were and or are remain young earth creationists. And so, sort of was rejected by a lot of people, actually lost friendships over this issue, which I know sounds to the outsider probably sounds sort of like crazy, but like actually is a thing, right? That, being told that I'm going to hell is sort of like a old hat to me at this point.
Sure.
And having people message me out of the blue, even just like last week, I had a message from someone like, hey, I knew you way back when. It's like, yeah, I remember you. It's like, oh, I'm praying for your soul because blah, blah, you're a creationism. And it's like, okay. But like, and you can kind of shrug that off. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't impact you, right? That it's still there and it still hurts. And, obviously, like I lost a lot of connections in the apologetics community too, because I full disclosure, like I fully embraced eventually like theistic evolution on every level, including human evolution and all of the above. And that puts me far outside of those circles as well. So yeah.
Yeah. And when I say that I haven't really landed, that's where I am too, but I'm also in the kind of I don't know, but this is just like based on everything that I know so far, that's where I am. Subject to change. I mean, it's kind of like the theological and scientific humility idea, right? Like I'm not going to say, yes, this absolutely is it. I'm subject to further review, essentially. What about you, Mandy?
Well, yes and no. Since my parents let me question, that certainly made a lot of things easier, but I had a really hard time in the church growing up in general. As a woman, you're not really encouraged to talk or ask questions. I mean, they would never say that.
Oh, some of
them.
But
some of them would.
MacArthur
but
would.
I mean, Southern Baptists aren't generally going around saying we expect our ladies not to talk, because there's also, the stereotype of like the Southern Baptist matriarch who like controls everything. But there is a difference between being like, yes, you're the person who controls and organizes everything versus you're the kid sitting in the back saying, but that's not true. I had a really hard time with my peers in church. Mostly I was horribly bullied in church. I had a great time in school. I fit in really well in public school. I was horribly bullied in church. because I was an outspoken, not super proper girl. Like, and I was weird. I was a nerd. Like I had always been a nerd. I was reading Star Wars books and stuff like that. So I used to the church hating me. So that there's, and being the kid who asks the hard questions, it just became like an aspect of my personality, right? It's just who I am, and has always been that way. Like I was the kid in elementary school saying, wait, you're saying Jesus never got sick because he's sinless?
Right.
Like that literally doesn't make sense, and they're like, well, you have to believe he's perfect. Oh, so he's perfect, so he doesn't get a cold? Like he had like 4 brothers and God knows how many sisters. You're telling me this kid never got a cold? Like, and they'd be like, yes. And you're just like, okay, you're wrong. And like, I would tell people that you're wrong. And they'd be like, well, you're wrong. And I'm like, well, you're stupid. And I'm smarter than you. And I'd say that to adults and like leave. Like, I mean, I was the kid when I went forward in church in first grade, right? So you're supposed to do that after you get saved. And I got saved in kindergarten. And I go forward and the pastor's like, now, honey, have you accepted Jesus into your heart? And I just looked up at him and I was like, do you think I would be standing up here if I hadn't? Like, that's like an aspect of my personality. Right. So was it hard? I mean, it's hard to be Mandy in the church.
Right.
But it's not because of evolution. So I don't know.
Leave aside that the accepting Jesus in your heart thing is just not biblical, but yeah.
It just occurred to me, I never brought it up in church spaces, evolution, so maybe that's why I didn't get into trouble, because I just felt that there was this separate thing, and to be honest, I rarely, with the exception of going to mass, rarely did church extracurricular activities. Although I think my mom was disappointed I didn't join CWA or something of the like, and just either read or watch TV, much to their disguise. Although I think in high school, I did rub some young ladies that I knew the wrong way, because I don't know how we got an involution, but there was one girl who kept calling me Monkey Man ever since, I discussed that with her, and it didn't bother me really, because I guess like Mandy go, well, I think I'm smarter than you are. So, and I didn't hate this person. So it's just like, move on if that's how she wants to deal with it.
Yeah. I have often envied Catholics, and I mean, it's not like Catholics are the only Christian group with a catechism at all, but like having that structure there, like here you can read up and down this and see here's what we believe. It's like a more detailed statement of faith, although I can't say that I've ever fully agreed with any church's statement of faith that I've attended, but that's just because but like in the mainline Protestant church in the US especially, right, it's so distilled down, or so descended down from like fundamentalism, that it's like we have this different set of mandatory beliefs that's been passed down and not questioned, and one of them is the the literal interpretation of Genesis. So in this process, kind of as you moved into thinking about scientifically about human origins and all that kind of stuff, was there anything that tipped you over into like, oh, okay, that's plausible, that makes sense to me? Or was it more of a kind of a gradual thing? So JW, you want to go first?
Did you say human origins specifically, or just origin science, or
either way?
Okay. Well, I would say there was like one major moment. So I was already sort of on the fence. I was mostly in the older creationist camp, and then I went to a evangelical philosophical society conference. And at that conference, there was a debate between Andrew Snelling, who's a geologist for Answers in Genesis, the Young Earth Creationist org, and I believe it was Greg Davidson, who's from a non-Young Earth organization. And he in the debate absolutely devastated the Young Earth position, and I'll spell it out, because I think this is actually really good, hopefully, for people to hear, which is he just pointed out that like he was talking about the Hawaiian Islands. And they did a study where basically all they did is they put a GPS signal on the Hawaiian Islands because yes, they're on a tectonic plate, and so they're moving, right?
Mhm.
And you measure how much they're moving per year. And they also measured with radiometric dating the age of the islands. And what they found is that if you just put a chart of how fast the islands are moving, and because they're getting spat up by a volcano, and the radiometric date, these dates corresponded exactly. So basically, what would have to happen for that would be that these two systems, so how far the islands are moving versus radiometric dating, would have to be like completely coincidentally aligned all the way across the board.
Right.
And I'm sitting there staring at this slide at the back of the hall, just like, wow, you know, like what do you do with that? And
Yeah.
so it's the moment where I was definitely like, their young Earth creation, I just can't ever go back. And I was sort of near that stage already, but that was the push me over the top.
Mhm. What about on the human origin side?
Human origins has been a much longer thing for me. I think if you're familiar with John Walton, he's written a lot about ancient Near Eastern studies and culture and how to read the Bible based on that. And basically, because for me, a lot of it was like I had to go theology first before I could accept science. I had to figure out that the theology made it okay before I could say, okay, the science is also okay.
Yeah.
And reading him and a few others made it like okay for me to be like, hey, you know what, especially as a Lutheran, because we also affirm the fall and things like that. I got to a space where it was just kind of like okay for me to say, hey, you know what, like the fall happened. Do I know how it happened? No, but like turns out God's way smarter than me, so like probably he has it figured out somewhere. And because the evidence for human evolution, when I started to read about that, just became so overwhelming that like that paired with John Walton kind of helped me figure it out.
What is the name of his book that it's on the tip of my tongue? Do you remember?
I guess it depends which one. I can look it up quick, but I know that he has like an ancient a Genesis cosmology one that was really helpful to me, but I don't remember
that's
the
the one I'm
title.
thinking of. I can't remember the title of it, but while you're looking it up, we can move on to Mandy.
There's not really an aha moment for me, just because it's something I've always been thinking about. My mom has always kind of had questions when it comes to human origins, because I guess that was more of a not something we really discussed that much until I got older. I think the thing that got me was actually the Bible. And when Cain leaves his family and he goes to a city.
Right. Whoever finds me will kill me. Well, who's finding you?
Right. What are these people? Who are they? Like it doesn't say like he found like another like he found a city, like a settlement. I mean, city, right? But and so it's like there are other people. And that's when I remember having the discussion with my mom about like there are other people on earth with Adam and Eve. And that's when she was like, well, let's think about that. Maybe that means, there were always people and Adam and Eve were just the first people with a soul, and those people didn't have souls, or whatever. Like, so then there's this distinction between like animals and what makes you a human. Right. And so if everything evolves and humans evolve from animals, but you get the human animal, but it's God who grants you the soul. Right. So you just start like thinking about these things and you're like, oh, so all of this can be real. All these humans came from somewhere. Right. And then I think this wasn't really an aha moment, I guess, but I remember having a conversation with a friend in college about evolution. Because, my thing has always been like, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. God created the universe.
Sure.
But she was like, well, I absolutely cannot believe in evolution. And I was like, well, that's ridiculous. Why absolutely cannot? Right? Why do you have to be a young earth creationist?
Yeah.
And she was like, her answer was basically evolution's not magical enough. Right. Like she didn't use the word magical. She used the word miraculous. And I'm like, so evolution's not miraculous. That's what you're telling me. And she was like, well, yeah. And I was like, so babies aren't miraculous. Right. She's like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, every baby who's born is therefore not a miracle.
Right.
Like, because they're born through biological means. They're like gestated in humans. right?
Yeah.
So that's not a miracle. That's just biology. And she's like, well, no, that's not true. Every baby is a miracle. And I'm like, so if evolution's real, it's still a miracle.
Right.
Like humans are here. Like,
And share a common ancestor with the grass in your backyard.
Yes.
So
yes. Like if
miracle.
anything, to me, that's crazier. Like going to the, kind of intelligent design, way of thinking about it. If God set up this set of dominoes, right, that means he spent a lot of time thinking about it. That means he knew everything that would happen. He set this all up instead of just being like human. He was like, let me plan this, like the greatest D&D campaign ever, like he put thought into it. And to me, that's more amazing that God would put thought into it. Right. But I guess just hearing that thought that evolution's not magical, and that would be a stumbling block to people, was just kind of really like this weird, like, so you need things to be magical to be true. Like, it was just a weird moment.
If you look at the language in Genesis 1, and it's the lost world of Genesis 1, right? Is that the Walton book? I think that's the one I was thinking.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
If you look at the language, right, let the land bring forth vegetation, right, and bring forth life. I'm thinking back to, I think JW were saying, or maybe it was you, Mandy, that if this had been explained to Moses, how would he have written it down?
Right. He wouldn't have.
I mean, if it had been shown to him, he might write down, let the land bring forth life, right? Because that's essentially exactly what happened. And say what you will about the Noah's Ark movie that Aronofsky did. It has a really beautiful creation retelling during the flood that I really thought was compelling. What about you, Juan?
I don't think I had an aha moment, although it's funny. I got to ask Mandy a question. The idea of a baby or an individual being a miracle, where did you come up with that? Because I have a sad geek source for where I first encountered that.
I mean, the church, every life is a miracle, right?
I got it through Alan Moore. No, the thing is, there's a scene where Dr. Manhattan on Mars has his eureka moment where he realizes that the existence of any human being is supposedly up to random, complete circumstances that your parents will meet and procreate. And that, but the thing is, there's 4 billion miracles that you don't, in the 80s, you don't care about it anymore, or the miracle seems small. So that just kind of, I thought that was an impactful way of looking at it. And also, I think there was like a look in the divine in that. But I don't, as I said, I don't think I just had a pushback. Although I did have there was a moment that I remember. I think I had a discussion with my older brother, who is a little bit more conservative, but at the same time, he's pro-Darwinian. I mean, I remember, he explains that the fall happened was when one man hit another man for a dopey reason, or probably even for any reason, and then. I always remember there was a fun time. I think we were clicking channels, and I don't know if we were watching a documentary or something, but there was a clip of like 2 cavemen, and I apologize if what I'm about to say might be offensive to some, but he goes, 2 cavemen fighting a dinosaur, and it was this crappy black and white B-movie level thing, and my brother goes, hey, there's Falwell and Swaggart, dealing, their thing, and I think that was kind of reforming, and I don't know when that happened, but I just remembered he said that. I wish I could remember more of a context of him saying that. So I don't know if that's an aha moment. It was just a reinforcing moment, and I at that point knew that he was completely Darwinian. My other brother is too, so it's Darwinian, and although it's interesting, you can do creation. I don't know if people see it. The first 2 books of the space series are kind of creation science fiction in a way. I mean,
sure.
The Silent Planet and Paralandria, I mean, they're horribly paced, but I think I tried to get, there was a member of my work who's a little bit, who's I think an engineer, but he was also a preacher on his off time. And I tried to say, hey, why don't you check out C.S. Lewis? He never encountered C.S. Lewis. He never heard of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And when I said, which, he goes, which, and he's like, that kind of gave him that was a red flag for him. So but I explained, I think I told him about the idea behind the Silent Planet and Paralandria. I mean, the third book I really bounced. I've always wanted to try to reread the third book because it was
Same.
just, oh, good.
Yeah.
I kind of like read through it, but I don't think I completely let it sink in.
Yeah, me neither. Paralandra I love, and I love that kind of representation that he does there of the garden. It's is really, really interesting book. For me, I think kind of as I started reading more sources, one of the compelling things that I saw in terms of arguments for evolution was the idea of convergence, where you have the idea that comes up from the theory that similar ecological niches should bring forth similar forms of life to fill them. And so if you take a similar niche in Australia and in New Mexico, you're going to find a mouse in both those places, right? But the one in Australia is going to be a marsupial mouse, and the one in New Mexico is going to be a placental mouse. And they're vastly different genetically, but the ecological niche there forced those forms on it. And it doesn't really make any sense from the creationist camp unless you just say, well, God wanted to do it that way, which is just not science. That's not science. You can't make predictions based on that. Where with evolution you can, and you can say, oh, we should see an apex predator someplace in the marsupial line, and we had that with the thylacine. It's extinct, unfortunately, the Tasmanian tiger. So that was an interesting one for me. And then, in terms of human origins, the discussion of the number of chromosomes between the great apes and humans, how it's different. They have 28, we have 26. And when we discovered that, and Ken Miller goes into this in, I can't remember if it was Finding Darwin's God or Only a Theory. I think it's both, actually. And you can find, maybe I'll link a presentation of his where he goes through this. He says, basically, if we can't figure out why we have a different number of chromosomes, then evolution goes out the window. And so we have to make a prediction based on it that in either we should see a dividing of chromosomes in the great apes or a fusing of chromosomes in humans. And that's exactly what we see. We see a fusing where we know what the ends of chromosomes looks like and what the middles look like. And so we have a chromosome, I can't remember which one it is, where the center of it is two ends stuck together. And we know that from study of genetics. And so I looked at that and I was like, wow, that's powerful. So I've kind of gotten to the point where my son asked me about it at some point because he went to a Christian school and he's taking science classes that are just complete teaching creation. And I was like, do I say anything? Do I say anything? And, he starts asking me questions and he's like, well, what do you think about the fall? And I said, well, my thinking, or not the fall, but like, what do you think of Adam and Eve? And I said, to me, there was a population of humans. And at some point they started looking for God. And he revealed himself. And that to me is kind of as close as I get to Adam and Eve. And then I look at like a verse, Romans 5, there's the verse that since by one man came sin, so sin spread to all man, for all man sin. It just makes me think that we're not talking about an original sin thing where one man sinned and then everybody inherits that. I kind of reject that. And I know that puts me solidly in the heretic camp. Historically, I look at it as, everybody has their fall moment, and we inevitably fall. If without that, I feel like, doctrines like the Immaculate Conception, right, where Jesus was protected from original sin in Mary's womb, it's there because we want Jesus to be perfect. We don't want him to have any sin, and original sin counts as sin. And to me, I'm like, if he was protected from original sin and could not possibly have sinned, what then is the value of his sinless life? If he couldn't have sinned, there's no merit to it. So and I know that puts me on a whole other heretical track. These are the rabbit holes you go down when you start thinking about these things. So I'll throw it back to you guys. Anybody who wants to say anything? JW, got anything?
I mean, I guess I wanted to say this isn't like something we've talked about yet, but I think that like for those who might be watching or listening to, one of the biggest things I ran into in creationism was just adding up the genealogies, right? You start with Adam, you add up the ages of everybody, that's how you get the age of the earth, right?
Right. Bishop Usher.
So that's some,
yeah.
Yes, yeah, Usher and others. And so I started to like do some research into that. And one thing that I did get from my LCMS upbringing, especially in college, was like, hey, you have to try to read the Bible, and it should, at least in some way, the way that you read the Bible should have made sense to the original hearers or writers or whatever. Now, I think that they're extremely inconsistent with that. But I took that and ran with it. And so I was looking into genealogies, and it's like in the ancient Near East, they did whatever they wanted with genealogies. And they have proof of this in multiple issues with like Sumerian king lists is a good example where like if I was a Sumerian king, which obviously that would not be true, but if I were, and I wanted to make a treaty with some guy over there, well, we would rewrite our genealogies so that we would have the same father, or that I might be his father because now he's my suzerain person, or vice versa. And they did this all the time, and we can see that they did this, and this was the exact same culture that the Bible sprang from. And so when you look into some of these things and you try to read the Bible how they read it, it doesn't make less sense. It doesn't make it so that you have to disbelieve it. It actually makes it make more sense, and it makes it align in ways that line up with reality and line up with what we see. And so like, to me, evolution is another one of those things. I like that you said the life springing from the earth, because that's something that I have taken as well. It's like, I mean, not that the Bible is teaching science, because I definitely don't think that whatsoever, but to say the Bible directly contradicts science only works if you read it in the most fundamentalist possible way.
Yeah.
And you can have, as you said, fundamentalists on the right, fundamentalists on the left, and everywhere in between. And unfortunately, those are the voices we hear about the most.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important. It's taking the Bible in its own context, right? And saying, what did this story mean to the people in that time period?
Yeah.
There's a podcast I listen to called The Bible for Normal People.
I was literally listening to them when I was walking my dog 10 minutes ago.
Yeah. And I think they talk about that, like, how does the biblical creation story compare to the standard Babylonian creation story of the time? And what was important that people were taking from it, right? Like, what was, because this wasn't teaching science to people in, 1000 BC or whenever, right? When they were spreading it by word, right? Like what were they supposed to get from it? And what they were supposed to get from it is God created the universe, and not through like violent means. Right. And it's like, well, evolution still meets that, right? God created the universe, not through, I mean, there's some minor like animal on animal violence in evolution, but not like, he didn't have to go kill another god for the universe to spring up, right? And even the Greek myths are that way, right? Like there's like gods conquering other gods, there's the Titans versus the gods, and it's like, no, God was able to do this on his own, right, independently, outside of nature, and he did it not to defeat someone else, but because ultimately he wanted us to exist, right? So he did it out of love. So it's like, if that's all I'm supposed to get from this, then young earth creationism, evolution, like that's literally not the point of the text. Right. The point of the text is God created us because he loves us.
Right. I think it is important, and we didn't mention it up to this point, that there's a caricature of evolution that draws it all the way back to life from unlife. And that's not really what like Darwin's theory was about. It was about the development of life from the time it began to now. Abiogenesis is a separate question, and there's all kinds of interesting modes of inquiry on that. But when we're talking about evolution in this context, at least, I'm not talking about the origin of life. I'm talking about the origin of human life.
Yeah, and I think that's important too. Like I remember I took a class in college that was basically comparative planetology. So it's like comparing all the planets in the solar system to each other. And of course, the one question everybody in the class wants to know that they keep pestering the teacher about was, well, how was the solar system created? Like, and she's like, well, we really don't know. Right. Like, we can observe. We can observe other solar systems in various states of, forming. But we don't have like a cohesive answer as to why does Earth have plate tectonics and Mars and Venus do not. because they don't, which was something we couldn't wrap. Like the week on plate tectonics like almost broke us, and we're like graduate students, right? Because we're like, what do you mean Mars and Venus don't have plates, but they still have tectonics? Like it's really weird. And it's like, we don't know why is there, like, because Venus is an active planet, Mars isn't, it's kind of a different, but there's no record of Mars ever having plates, right? It's not like the plates froze in place. There are just no plates. And it's like, but Earth has plates. Why? I don't know. Like nobody knows. It just is.
That's so the fountains of the deep can get up through them.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, how did they determine that Venus is an active planet? I assume...
It has a magnetic field.
Oh, that's the only. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Mars does not have a magnetic field. So Mars is dead, like in its core. And it actually has little like residual magnetic fields that are from leftover like metal deposits under the surface, right? So you got little magnetic stuff.
Yeah.
But Venus has an active magnetic field, and we can measure that.
Okay, I knew Mars didn't have a magnetic field. I didn't know that was the criteria for, I guess, which I assume you meant geologically active.
Well, no, because you can be, so it's like there's no molten core on Mars, right? Because somehow that's all related. And once again, I'm not even sure they really know how that is related either. Like, because they'll be like, some people will be like, well, the planet spins one way because the core spins another way, but we actually don't know that. Right? Like we've not, the movie The Core has not happened. We have not sent anyone down into the core of the planet. So
that trailer did not impress me at all. So
it's a terrible movie. Don't watch it.
I saw that movie
unless you really want to watch a terrible movie. Then
if you want to go to a B movie, it's fantastic.
Yes. Yes.
Where you have Stanley Tucci monologuing into a recording device right before he dies, and then realizing, why am I doing this?
The tape might survive.
Not the Earth's core.
No.
Not at the Earth's core. Yeah. I had another thought, but I don't remember what it was. So do we want to move on, or any other thoughts on what we've been talking about?
I had just one brief thing too, is that I think something else that's valuable to realize is that the way that people have thought about science and faith has evolved quite a bit, even in the last 200 years or so. And I actually have a book. I'm blurred. Ronald Numbers. Ronald Numbers, The Creationists. He basically writes the story of how creationism arose, especially in the United States. And because there's like this sort of general consensus among creationists that like this is just what the church has always believed and what we've always thought, and
that is not true.
And that's just patently untrue. It's not even close to being the case. And I think it's really valuable to learn that, and so spread the word.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that's one of the great myths of modern Christianity, specifically Protestant Christianity, is that people have always thought this way, whether it's about creationism or anything, right? Whether it's about the rapture or salvation or, penal substitutionary atonement, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Like they'll be like, oh, people have always thought this way. And you're like, actually, this thought only goes back like 200 years, right? Like, or whatever it is. And the evolution of Christian thought is like completely different. If you go back and ask a Christian what they believed in like 1400, it's going to be a completely different answer from what it is today. And we don't appreciate that. And all of this for me comes back to modern Protestant Americans particularly act like there is a theological test at the gates of heaven.
Right.
That you were going to get there. And they're going to ask JW, well, what do you believe about evolution? And you're gonna be like, well, I think it's true. And they're gonna be like, nah, I don't care that you follow Jesus, you're out. Right. And it's like, that's just not how it works. Do you even think a peasant in 900 AD even thought about this?
Right.
Like, it's just not part of their life. They don't care. So.
Yeah. The history of kind of Christian reinterpretation based on science, it's rich. There's a lot of it there. And when you start telling somebody, yeah, I accept evolution, they're like, wow, you've just really compromised with the modern world on this. And I think, well, do you believe in that the earth is flat? Because if you don't, you compromised based on somebody else's beliefs way back when. If you think that the earth isn't the center of the universe, that got you into a lot of trouble in Galileo's day. And so, or that the planets moved, right? That the earth moved. That was that was compromise back then. And then, science progresses. We make observations. We look at it and we go, okay, well, the thing that I've been assuming was correct from my reading of scripture was obviously wrong. And we change. And this, I think, is no exception to that. But people think that's the way it's always been. So.
Although, did creationism become a big thing during the Cold War as a response to the atheistic Soviet Union, or is it more complicated than that?
I think it goes back to Darwinism and Enlightenment era. So there was, before the Enlightenment, other than the Galileo Copernicus astronomy thing, there really wasn't much care about science versus the Bible that I can find. It was like people were just in general more mystical, right? And then suddenly, people start having like facts and things like that. And suddenly, particularly in the Protestant church, they're like, well, we have to counter this with our own facts. Right. And they were like, well, the Bible must be 100% literal truth. And I mean, inerrancy as a really strong belief that people thought about it really comes out of that, and the Enlightenment and Darwinism and all of that kind of stuff. Inerrancy only goes back to that. It's only like, what is that now, like 200 years old?
And it's immensely problematic.
And so it's just like, this is a very, in the scale of the world, modern problem.
We've talked a little bit about, I know at least one of you guys has talked about friction from other believers, and so I do want to talk more about that. Like, as you've come to your current position, JW, you talked about it a bit, about people basically writing you off as a non-Christian now. Is that still happening now, or is that in your past?
Like I said, I just got an email like within the last couple weeks saying the same thing, and on my blog, I not infrequently I edit all the comments and moderate them, because I just don't want it to be a cesspool of comments, which it can easily turn into. And I at least once or twice a year, I get someone who's like really big into questioning my faith purely based on this exact issue. Now, there's plenty of other issues that they, draw on as well, but the age of the earth, I would say, it's a hugely hot button issue. And again, because that ties into, in their minds and in my mind growing up, it ties into everything else. If you compromise is the great word. If you compromise on the age of the earth, then you're going to compromise on X, Y, and Z and everything else. And it all is a house of cards. It will all collapse. And, I would say, thankfully, that's not true. I mean, I consider myself a very devout believer to this day. And the fact that I think that, I have a common ancestor with the grass in my backyard, as we said, it doesn't impact that for me. In fact, amazing. It actually sort of makes it richer in a way, in that it makes the belief in creation more beautiful to me. But no, I think that pushback is very real, and it very much exists. I mean, and I think if you sat down in most, especially LCMS churches, I'll just use my own former denomination. If you sat down in those churches and you asked members in the pew what they thought, you would get a variety of views, but the pastors would almost universally be young earth creationists and be very disturbed that any of their members would not agree with them on that. And I know that from observation from multiple churches.
Mm-hmm. There's a reason I'm not an elder at any church. I feel like I couldn't sign on to whatever creed I had to sign on to, I'm sure. What about you, Mandy? I mean, you teach in a church, right?
I do.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Nobody knows what I'm doing. No, that's not true.
Yeah. Well, I guess the question is, what do you get to teach?
I teach middle school Sunday school. And I've really had a lot of freedom. I go through the entire Bible in 3 years because I have all the middle schoolers. We mostly focus on people. We do a topical evolution versus creation summer lesson every year in which I tell them the answer is it doesn't matter. And anyone who's trying to get in a fight with you over this is stupid. Like, this is not like the thing that I'm foundationally trying to teach them is that their faith is not a house of cards, like JW said, because so many of us grew up in a way where it said, well, if you remove this, the whole thing crumbles.
Right.
I'm like, the only thing you can really remove from Christianity and the whole thing crumbles is Jesus. Right. Like, everything else is kind of ancillary.
Well, I would be more specific. There was a science fiction fan who sadly passed away several years ago by the name of Ross Palvik, and he actually did a panel at Worldcon where he did. Unfortunately, they didn't agree what the panel was about. It was with Joe Straczynski, who's an atheist who's at least pro-religion. If you've seen the show, if you've seen Babylon 5, you might get what I'm saying about that. But one of the things that at least somebody asked Ross, you know, somebody asked each of them, what would cause you to believe in the other's belief? What would make Ross an atheist and what would make Joe a deist, at least? And Ross's thing is you just have to produce the body of Christ. And I thought, okay, that makes theological sense, because if you prove that Christ never resurrected, then you really got nothing. You know, you just got a, you know, and I'm not, I hope this doesn't come offensive. You just got another dead prophet.
Right.
So I mean, that's basically what Paul says in Corinthians, right? So.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that was strictly in the Bible. I thought that was Ross's.
Our faith is in vain.
Right. So, you know, that's the only thing. I remember somebody did get, and this is a person I consider a friend. They get it. Somehow we got into a discussion. I don't know if it was at a con panel, but it was in a con environment, and he's a writer. And he goes, so what do you have to do? Is there a tattoo? Where's the forensics? He was making a joke, but there's no forensic way to prove, even if you did find a over 2,000-year-old corpse, how can you prove that is the corpse of Jesus, you know, the Nazarene, you know? And it's a, you know, you say, well, wait, if just the only way you can break it is an impossible way to prove, so it's kind of like a contradiction. So and that's why I get more specific. I mean, I think you could have Jesus, but you have to prove that Jesus died without a shadow of a doubt.
You have to have the resurrection, right? You don't actually have to have the virgin birth, but you have to have
I get that.
The resurrection, right? You have to have the death and resurrection. And that's what I really try to give the middle schoolers are like, what are the things that actually matter? And what are the things where I really don't care about your opinion? Which is not to mean I don't care about your opinion, but like your opinion on this is not keeping you out of the gates of heaven, right? Like, is Jonah a fable or not?
Right.
I don't think it matters, right? Is Job, like, I literally taught Job like in December, and I was like, Job probably didn't happen. And like, we walked through the whole thing. We walked through like, you know, the adversary and how this was really like a philosophical thought process. And no parent in my church has come after me. And I publish all the lessons on the internet. Like, you know, they can see them all, like everything's up there. Whenever I'm going to touch on something particularly touchy, because not theologically, but like, you know, we do like a sexual assault lesson and like a suicide lesson and things like that, because they're in middle school. You know, we always send on email, and I've never had a parent come after me. My church, you know, kind of like, you know, what JW is saying, like, what if you ask people in the pews what they think? I think you're going to get a huge variety of thought, right? I know my pastors are a lot more conservative than I am, but they also know how crazy I am, because I go to this one Bible study class on Wednesday nights where the pastor like walks through a book of the Bible, and every time he says something, I'm like, but why do we think that? Why does this matter? Like, does this really matter? But I also know, you know, that a lot of people don't think about these things. I remember one Wednesday night fellowship. So, you know, you have dinner beforehand and then you go to class, right? And I'm sitting there and I'm talking about like another heretical thought, right? Which is like, what do I really feel about hell? And I'm trying to talk to this other woman about this. And she's like, well, Mandy, I've just never thought about it. And I'm like, you're like older than me. Like, you know, like you're telling me you've made it to 40 and you've never thought about like any of this, you know? And she's like, yeah, I just don't think about it. And I think that's pretty average for most people. Right. And then there are some of us who are just really deep thinkers, and we have to drill down on these things. Right. So
it's easy to project that on other people and be like, well, you should be doing this. And so I'm going to tell you.
Right. And I'm like, sometimes I wish I didn't think about these things.
Yeah.
Although you
Life
brought up
would be-
you brought up another memory of me, and I don't know if it's related, but I was talking somehow I got into a theological discussion with fellow Catholics at my work, and I just mentioned Dante and Milton, and they just gave me blank looks, and I was kind of surprised they had never heard of either of them, and they were engineers, they were quite intelligent people. I'm kind of surprised they didn't even come across with them in an English class. It's like 7 layers of hell. To serve in hell is better than to rule hell is better than to serve in heaven.
Right.
It's like, no, what are you talking about? And they thought, and I remember discussing this with my brother, and he goes, what do you mean they based it on the Bible? That because these people thought, well, those guys made it up. Dante and Milton made it out of whole cloth. And it goes, no, that was in the Bible. The war in heaven and all that stuff was
the war
somewhere
in
the
heaven
Bible.
is not in the Protestant Bible. I will
Oh,
say.
okay.
Yeah.
Well,
there
it's
definitely
somewhere.
has been a lot of post hoc theologizing that's gone from Milton back into the Bible. All the stuff about the fall of Satan, the Lucifer thing. I mean, that passage does not say, it's not talking about Satan. It's talking about the king of Tyre.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there that I mean, in the Catholic Church, right? You don't just have the Bible. You have sacred tradition. You have the magisterium. You have other sources. But for us Protestants, we're like, yeah, nope.
Yeah, some of my fellow Catholics might find, or even a friend of mine might find this a little bit obnoxious. I once quoted, I think it was a joke by Rosie O'Donnell. It says, "No, we don't read the Bible. We have people to do that for us." and it's true. We don't.
Yeah.
I mean, we do have. I think if you want to volunteer for Bible study, but that's an extra thing. I mean, as I said, you get the 3 round of cycles of the same Bible passages every 3 years. So it's like,
yeah. In Protestant circles, right, emphasis on reading the Bible personally is really, really important. And I did want to say, anybody watching this who's going to jump down into the comments and say, well, maybe if you read your Bible more. I set out when my son was born to read the Bible every year, and I have done that. So I read the Bible 20 plus times all the way through. I've read commentaries. It's been a very serious study on the Bible and on these topics. So don't at me about my lack of reading the Bible.
Out
and
of
I know
curiosity,
Mandy, as a teacher, right? Yeah.
I read commentaries for fun.
Yeah.
Like, I take this, like, I have like a wall of comment. Like I have like Jewish commentaries. I have like, what's amazing? Sorry, it is amazing that even in the most conservative of commentaries, there is stuff in there they would never tell a congregation.
Yeah.
And I find it like, I'm like, this is in a like Lifeway approved commentary, right? Like, if you're getting that Lifeway stamp, you're a Baptist, kind of like, and they're saying things that are like, this probably didn't happen. And it's like, but no pastor would say that from the pulpit, right? Yeah. It's like they don't trust us, but that's besides the point. No, I study the Bible a lot. I take it very seriously. It is funny because there was one time I commented on something online and I was like, well, I'm not a Bible scholar, but I'm pretty sure it says blah, 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 blah. Yeah. And they like, these people were like, well, let me explain the Bible to you. And I'm like, no. Right. When I say I'm not a Bible scholar, I mean, I didn't go to seminary.
Right.
Like studying the Bible is like my hobby. Like it's what I do for like fun. I don't, how many Bibles I own, like in every translation, like in different languages. Like I really wanted a Latin Vulgate. I don't have one yet, sadly. I took 4 years of Latin in high school though. So I'm prepared.
I am curious because how long does it take to read the Bible cover to cover?
So for me, the way I do it every year is I read 5 chapters a day. And that gets me through by mid-November. And well, usually what I do is I do 5 chapters of the Old Testament Monday through Thursday, and then I do 5 chapters in the New on Friday, and I read a psalm every day. And so I kind of bypass the psalms by the time I get to them. But yeah, that gets me through easily in a year. And it's one of those things like reading a book like Dune, right? The first time you read it, it might be a little bit of a slog. Second time it's easier. And third time you're like, yeah, I love reading this. It's the same thing with the Bible. Once you've read it all the way through, it makes it a lot less intimidating. There are passages that I always skim, like the first 9 chapters of First Chronicles, because it's all genealogies.
I can't handle Leviticus.
Yeah.
I'm
Exodus
a
is pretty
Lutheran.
brutal
I
too.
love Leviticus.
I always joke that the last 10 chapters of Exodus that's talking about the construction of the tabernacle, and it basically says here are all the designs, and then it goes through like, and Bezalel or whatever his name is went and did this and that and this and that. I just want the engineer's Bible where it says, and Bezalel built it to spec. That's all I want. Just replace those last 10 chapters with that. But yeah, I think the problem is that for a lot of people, taking the Bible seriously means taking a conservative approach to it. And that's the way they think.
Well, not necessarily. It was kind of funny. I think about before COVID, I decided to loan an atheist friend of mine. I got this, I think, I used to work at a public library, so people would dump their books that we would use for book sales. And that's how I got a copy of Asimov's Guide to the Bible, which Asimov explained that he was doing it from a completely secular point of view. I mean, he was an atheist. He wasn't even looking at it at a religious Jewish point of view. And I haven't read it cover to cover. I mean, I've read parts of it, and I gave it to my friend. Hey, check it out. I mean, he was just, looking at the Bible as literary, historical, and everything except religion. So, and I loaned it to him, and he eventually gave it back to me after COVID, left it on my desk, and I forgot what he thought about it, but. But I mean, obviously he wasn't looking at it, at least I don't think he was looking at it from a conservative point of view.
Yeah. Any resources that any of you would recommend to people who are questioning this kind of thing, that are like on this journey? I have a long list. I'm sure JW and Mandy, you probably have long lists as well. Why don't you go first, JW?
All right, great. I actually stacked up a few next to my computer so I can show them now that I unblurred my screen. So I already mentioned The Creationists by Ronald Numbers.
Nice.
It's just a history of creationism. There's The
I
Biblical Flood. The Biblical Flood by Davis A. Young. So that one basically just goes over how the church has thought about extra biblical evidence related to Noah's flood. So super important for young creationism because a lot of that ties into the flood. This one, the cover is not very exciting, but it's called Genealogy and History in the Biblical World by Robert R. Wilson. This one, basically, he just talks about genealogies throughout the ancient Near East, points to how they were used, and talks about the biblical genealogies and how like everything that you think you know about them is probably wrong. There's Mapping the Origins Debate. If you're interested in like different views about how can we actually think about science and origins, that's a really good place to start. And then I only have two more, sorry. So this one, Perspectives on an Evolving Creation, edited by Keith Miller. Just has some really great essays in it. When I was a younger creationist, I got it because I wanted to refute everything in it, and I couldn't even come close to it. And now it's kind of become like a read that I do every couple of years. And then the final one is The Bible, Rocks, and Time. Again, Davis Young and Ralph Burley. Yeah, so this one's just a fantastic resource. If you want to see what the evidence in geology especially says about the age of the Earth, this is a great one. And I mean, these aren't like, to use the word that's the buzzword, these aren't like crazy liberals out there. Like these are very conservative, scholars. It's IVP published book, and they just talk about the geological evidence.
Yeah, that's a great one. That's one that was on my list as well. I had another one from D.A. Young that was Christianity in the Age of the Earth. So it's just a survey of that approach, and it's shocking when you read it for the first time if you've only ever heard the fundamentalist idea, because like you said earlier, Mandy, it's a very new idea. What about you, Mandy? Any resources?
I don't have any books I think I'd recommend. I don't have any books specifically on the topic. I do think the Bible for Normal People podcast is great.
Yeah.
There are some episodes specifically about Genesis.
The Pete Ewan's Genesis ones? No, I guess it's Pete Ewan's Exodus. That's what he's been doing.
I think he ruins Exodus. I think they have a couple on the evolution of Adam, which is the name of one of their books.
That's the one of Pete Enns' books.
Yeah. Yes. And I have not read The Evolution of Adam, though it's on my list of books to read. I do love all of Pete Enns' books. I think I think when I recommend to people in general is the sin of certainty, because I feel like that's what this all comes back to. You know, like, do you like, we like to feel like we're certain about everything, that we have to be certain.
Yeah.
And it's like, you don't have to be, and it's okay. Like,
Yeah.
and you know, I just encourage people to not look at their faith as a house of cards, and
Right.
really ask themselves, if it is that really faith?
Right.
If your faith is a cobweb, I mean, if that's all you have right now, that's fine. But
Sure.
look at shoring that up, right?
Yeah.
Like, you need a stronger foundation than a
Mhm.
house of cards, right? And I really don't think there's anything anyone could throw at me other than we invented time travel and, you know, go back in time and see Jesus did not resurrect.
Right.
That would, you know, shock my faith to its core.
Right. It's been done
So
in science fiction, right? Behold the Man.
yes, there are many science fiction stories.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
about that kind of thought.
you just reminded me of Robert Silverberg's Up the Line, where I think Silverberg's essential objective of the novel is all the pictures you see of cavalry, all the people you see there are actually time travelers just to witness the crucifixion.
Okay.
And I think that novel sets that up, that why are there so many people seeing the death of this, you know, rabble rouser from Nazareth, you know?
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing I come back to at the end of the day is the, you know, guy who asked Jesus, what's the most important law?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Does he say you have to believe creationism? Does he
Right.
say,
And
does he
inerrancy.
even say believing God created the universe? Right? No,
Yeah.
he says love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor
Mhm.
as yourself. And it's like, so where does, you know, any theological test
Yeah.
fall under that?
Yeah. It should all come back to that. Right.
Right. And you know, the other thing I think about for me is, you know, doesn't matter as long as you believe God created the universe,
Mhm.
right? You know, maybe it's okay not to think about it for those of you who are not thinking
Yeah.
about it,
Mhm.
right? But it's like, if you are struggling with it, if you're like, how can I believe this evolution with what it says in the Bible? Like, maybe it literally doesn't matter.
Sure. Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, God created the universe. Move
Yeah,
on.
and that's
It's
the thing
okay.
about like drawing the ire of family and that kind of stuff. You know, like I don't typically talk about this stuff with people I go to church with, or even with family all that often, unless it's like my son and he's asking me a direct question, and then yeah, we're going to have that talk. But it's not worth losing friendships over, losing fellowship with people. But I'm not going to lie about it either. Right?
Yeah, no.
And so I think the humility idea of just like, whatever your position is, don't assume the other person has bad motives because they disagree with you.
Yeah.
For resources, BioLogos is a really good website, and they've got a hub. They've got tons of information. There's some videos from Dennis Venema, who does work for BioLogos. That's like, there's one literally titled "Can an Evangelical Christian Accept Evolution?" He co-wrote a book with Scott McKnight called "Jesus and the Genome," I think, which is really good. And so what it is, it's like, scientist explains the science behind evolution, and then a theologian comes in and says, here are the implications of it. And so it's a really good resource for people. And then there's another one from BioLogos, a book called Origins, Christian Perspectives on, I can't remember, Christian Perspectives on something, blah, 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 on creation, evolution, and intelligent design. And one really cool thing in that is at the very end of the book, they've got an appendix of like the spectrum of views on origins, all the way from like literal ancient Near East literalism, flat earth, you know, dome of you know, waters above and waters below kind of stuff, to theistic evolution. And it's really informative to read that. But it's a really, really good book. And then yeah, the Bible for Normal People is great. Another podcast I enjoy is You Have Permission, but that one's not as specifically about biblical interpretation. It's more about engaging different perspectives. What do you think? I mean, we've been talking about, so kind of summing up, is there any harm to someone saying, like you said, Mandy, I just don't think about those things? Is there any harm to that? Is there any harm to someone saying, no, it's important, or no, it's not important?
mean, I would say if you're the person who says, I don't think about these things, there is no harm,
Yeah.
right? The peasant in 500 AD did not think about these things.
Sure.
Not thinking about these things doesn't mean you're going to hell.
Right.
If you believe in that.
As long as you're not saying, I don't think about these things, but my default is this one. And if you believe differently, you're probably wrong.
Right. I think that's different. I think there are a lot of people who just don't think about these things. And they're like, well, my church teaches X, so that's what I believe. But, you do you. It's like, okay. When you're going after people, when your theology starts hurting people, like JW's friends telling him he's going to hell over his belief in evolution, that's just, they're practicing bad theology. Right. Like, it doesn't matter what their belief in evolution is. What matters is that they're telling a fellow Christian who believes in the, resurrection of Jesus, that he's going to hell over an interpretation of Genesis 1, right? Like that is using your theology as a sword to hurt people. Right. And I don't think that's how Jesus operated or wanted us to operate. How does that fall? How does that fall under loving JW? Even if you really think creationism is 100% right, do you think approaching it from that manner is going to get him back? No, like, so it comes back to this, like, insisting we have to be right, which I feel like is a very American thing. I don't know about the rest of the world, but in America, we like to win. Right. And I think that's just not what it's about. Right. So, if you believe in evolution, if you believe in young earth creationism, like, this is not an excuse to attack each other. Do we really need to create like more denominations over this? I don't know. But, it's all about, what does this faith mean? What does this mean for you personally? And does it help you in your walk? Right. If believing in evolution keeps you believing in Jesus, that's a good thing. Right. Like, if discovering evolution and that you were lied to is what throws you out of the church is doing something wrong.
Right. Well, and I think that's a pretty common story. Like, when you look at all the stories of deconstruction, it was because they had that brick wall or house of cards faith, where that foundation stone was literal interpretation. And once you remove that, everything just boom went away. And I think we've raised several generations of kids that way. And now we're seeing it come back to roost. Final thoughts from anybody? I think, is there anything else we want to cover? No, it doesn't sound like it. So I think this was a good discussion. I'm glad to, like, it's really, really easy to feel alone when you're doing these investigations, especially when you encounter friction from other people. And so I think I'm hoping that this is a resource for somebody out there who's like, I've been thinking about this stuff, but it's uncomfortable to talk about. So I'm presenting myself as somebody, if you want to shoot me an email, feedback@hugospodcast.com. I'm happy to talk about it. And I'm sure that anybody else on this call would do that as well.
I always love talking about theology.
Yeah, me too. It's fun. So, and I don't know if it's like the reason that I enjoy science fiction and is the speculation, so yeah, that it works in all parts of my life, theology as well. So, okay. Do you want to give out any contact information? Anybody? Mandy, do you want to?
Sure. I'm on Twitter at Brown_Aja. That's AJAH.
I feel like people understand that better now that the Wheel of Time show.
That the Wheel of Time is out. Yeah. Though I don't know if any Browns were really in it yet.
No, there weren't. Yeah.
Hold out hope for Varen in season 2. But I can be found there. I have a podcast that we haven't done anything with in a long, long time. It's at Trivially Crucial. Or it's at Triv Crucial on Twitter, but it's Trivially Crucial. My friend Michael and I talk about different stories. And you can find me around the internet.
Cool. And we miss you, Michael.
Yeah, we
Sorry
do.
You couldn't make it. Yeah. What about you, JW?
Yeah, I can be found on Twitter at JWWartic, so WARTICK. My website, jwwartic.com, spelled the same way, conveniently enough. And then I also have a science fiction / everything else website, Eclectic Theist, so eclectictheist.wordpress.com. So feel free to contact me. I love talking about this stuff. Even if you want to tell me I'm going to hell, I'll still talk to you. So
you can mute some of those people. But yeah, I also want to say, was it on your main site that you've been doing the Leaving the Missouri Synod series?
yeah, so that's on the jwwartic.com site. If you go there and you just look at the why I left the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, I have a hub post that goes to it, and a big part of that is due to science, but there
Right.
are lots of other reasons as well.
Yeah, when I saw you publishing those, I thought, okay, we should probably get this going because it's in the same conversation. So, and you've done reviews of a bunch of books on the topic as well, right?
Oh yeah,
yeah.
dozens. Yeah.
Yes, because you are probably the fastest reader I've ever heard of. What about you, Juan?
Oh, I'm envious of JW. He is a fast reader. My contact information is at Rainbow War 71 on Twitter. Right now, I'm not doing anything podcasting wise. If you want to catch me on Facebook, I'm there too. That's about it for social media. And I usually just follow a lot of science fiction and follow a lot of science fiction social media.
Cool.
I will say go back because I never plug this because I'm never on Bible podcasts. My website is apself.com. So Amanda, that's the A, P is my middle initial, self.com. All of my middle school Sunday school lessons are on there. Okay. Also during COVID, I did some as YouTube video. Well, I did some as Twitch streams for the middle schoolers. So there are links to YouTube videos for a lot of the lessons in there. And if you really want to know my craziness, I highly recommend my 2 lessons on what is the Bible and translating the Bible, which are on YouTube, but you can link to it from my website. So
nice. Okay, well, thank you all for doing this. This was a lot of fun.
You didn't plug yourself, Seth. Where are you on the internet?
I'm on Twitter at Heasley Seth, but I never log into that account because I do all my tweeting from the Hugo's podcast Twitter because my wife doesn't follow it. So she doesn't have to see my corny jokes and complaints about random things. Thank you all for doing this. I know I've been saying let's do this since like last September, but I'm glad we finally did. Okay, and thank you anybody for watching. It will be on the YouTube channel, so you can comment there if you'd like to. If you're just going to tell us we're going to hell, then just maybe refrain. Or if you're going to tell us it is science fiction because you're talking about the Bible, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but that's not clever. I see it on YouTube videos all the time, and I'm just like, has nobody told them they're not funny? But that's okay. No. Anyhow, thank you for listening or watching, and bye-bye.